A janitor on his knees scrubbing a hallway floor. A 12-year-old boy denied lunch in front of a full cafeteria. Neither of them knew their lives were already connected. The morning fog was still sitting low over the rooftops of Jefferson Heights when the first school buses rolled down Garrison Avenue. September in Birmingham carried that particular kind of heat that felt like summer refusing to admit it was finished, thick and slow, pressing down on everything underneath it. The oak trees lining the front walkway of Jefferson Heights High School had barely begun to turn. The building itself looked the same as it had for 40 years, red brick gone slightly orange with age-wide front steps worn smooth in the center from decades of sneakers and dress shoes and the shuffling weight of thousands of children who passed through and kept going. Inside the main lobby was already crowded with teachers who had arrived early, which was not a coincidence. Word had moved through the staff, the way word always moved in a school building, fast and slightly distorted, carrying more energy than the facts alone could justify. The new principal was coming in today. Not just new to Jefferson Heights, but new to the whole idea of the job, the youngest building principal in Birmingham City Schools district history. 32 years old, a doctorate from the University of Alabama, some kind of rising star in education reform circles, or so the story went. Ms. Patricia Yates from the English department had looked him up the night before and reported back that his dissertation was 94 pages long and cited over 200 sources. Mr. Donnelly from the history department said that sounded exhausting. Ms. Yates said it sounded impressive. They were both right. At 8:14 in the morning, a black district sedan pulled up to the front steps, and Dr. Patricia Hale, superintendent of Birmingham City Schools, stepped out first. She was 60 years old, trim and deliberate in everything she did, the kind of woman who had spent 3 decades navigating rooms that were not built with her in mind, and had quietly outlasted every obstacle in them. She straightened her jacket, looked up at the building for one brief moment, then turned back toward the car. Marcus Reed stepped out onto the sidewalk. He wore a charcoal gray suit, slim cut with a white shirt and a burgundy tie. He was tall, composed, with thin-framed glasses that gave him a certain stillness, like someone who had learned early that the best way to be taken seriously was to look like you already were. His face was calm in the way that took practice, not the blankness of someone with nothing going on, but the steadiness of someone who had learned to keep the interior separate from the exterior. He stood at the base of the front steps and did not move immediately. He looked at the building. Not the way someone looks at a new workplace, cataloging exits and entrances, calculating logistics. He looked at it the way a person looks at something they have been carrying inside them for a long time without a name for it. His eyes moved from the roofline to the double front doors, to the oak trees, to the worn, smooth center of the bottom step. Something shifted in his face. Not enough for Dr. Hale to catch, not enough for the teachers peering through the lobby windows to notice. But it was there. Dr. Hale said his name gently, and he nodded and followed her up the steps. The lobby received him warmly. Teachers introduced themselves in quick succession, first names and subject areas, and years of service offered up like small gifts, each person trying to place themselves in the story of this new person's arrival. Marcus shook hands and remembered names and asked small, precise questions that made each teacher feel briefly that they had said something worth responding to. He was good at this. It was not performance. It was genuine attention, which is rarer and harder to sustain than performance, and it showed. Then halfway across the lobby, Marcus slowed. Near the far set of doors that led toward the gymnasium, a custodial cart sat against the wall. Standard school-issue gray metal frame, flat mop head resting in a wringer bucket, a small shelf along the side, holding spray bottles and folded rags. There was nothing remarkable about it. Carts like that existed in every school hallway in America. Most people walked past them without registering they were there at all. Marcus stopped. Not fully. Not the kind of stop that would draw attention. More like a hesitation in his stride, a slight drag in his forward motion, as if something in his body recognized something before his mind had caught up. He looked at the cart for 2 full seconds. Then Dr. Hale touched his arm lightly and said his name again, and he continued walking, and the moment passed. No one in the lobby noticed. There was no reason they would have. What Marcus Reed did not say to any of those teachers, did not say to Dr. Hale, did not say to the Birmingham City Schools District Board when they offered him the position, was this: he had not been randomly assigned to Jefferson Heights. He had requested it, specifically, in writing. When the board had offered him a newer school across town, a school with a renovated gym and a higher standardized test ranking, and a parent advisory board that actually showed up to meetings, Marcus had politely declined and submitted a formal letter requesting Jefferson Heights instead. The board had been confused. Dr. Hale had asked him directly in her office across a conference table whether he understood that Jefferson Heights was one of the most under-resourced schools in the district. Marcus had said yes. She had asked whether he understood the challenges involved. He had said yes. She had looked at him for a long moment, then signed the paperwork. She assumed it was idealism. The best kind, the kind that might actually survive contact with reality long enough to do some good. She was not wrong about the idealism. She was just missing the part that came before it. This is one of those black stories that nobody wrote down. One of those real-life stories that lived quietly inside a school building for 20 years before anyone thought to ask the right question. The question was simple. It was only 4 words long, but in 20 years not one person had thought to ask it. Who kept Marcus Reed in school? Because everything in his life at 12 years old was pushing him out. The empty refrigerator. The mother who worked until her feet ached and still came up short. The shame that attached itself to poverty like a second skin, invisible to everyone except the person wearing it. All of it had been pushing him toward the door, and somehow he had stayed. Somewhere in this building right now, 2 floors below the office where Marcus Reed was settling into his new chair, a man in a Navy uniform was restocking a custodial cart in a basement storage room. He had been restocking that same cart in that same room for 35 years. He had no idea that the new principal had arrived. He had no idea who the new principal was. He had no idea that the boy he once watched sit down at an empty cafeteria table with nothing on his tray had just walked back through the front doors of Jefferson Heights High School. And he had no idea that a single year of quiet, anonymous choices made on a custodian's salary, with no signature and no expectation of anything in return, was about to come back to find him. 20 years before Marcus Reed stood in that lobby in his charcoal suit, he was 12 years old and trying very hard to be invisible. Jefferson Heights in October of 2004 felt like a different world than the building Marcus had walked into this morning. Though the bones were the same brick walls, the same long corridors, the same cafeteria with its fluorescent lights that buzzed faintly and made everything look slightly more tired than it actually was. The oak trees out front were smaller then. The linoleum floors were a different shade, darker, more worn in the middle where the foot traffic concentrated. The building smelled the same industrial cleaner and cafeteria steam, and the particular staleness of a place where hundreds of people spent their days in close quarters. Marcus at 12 was thin in the way that children are thin when they are growing faster than the food available to them. He wore a gray hoodie that was clean but slightly too small in the sleeves, and a backpack with a broken zipper on the main compartment that he held shut by threading a pen through the pull tab. He had been meaning to fix it for 3 months. He had not fixed it, because fixing it required buying a new zipper or a new bag, and neither of those things was happening anytime soon. He arrived at the cafeteria early. This was deliberate. If he got in line before the rush, The transaction at the register happened with fewer witnesses. He had developed this habit, the way children develop all survival habits quietly, without naming it, simply doing the thing that reduced the chance of pain. His daily lunch was always the same. The standard school tray, a rectangle of pale plastic with divided sections, whatever the hot option was that day, alongside a carton of milk and a side that changed, but never quite improved. Marcus ate this meal because most mornings there was nothing at home before school. Denise Reed left for her hospital shift at 5:30 in the morning, and the apartment was dark and quiet when Marcus woke up. He learned to move through those mornings efficiently, to not linger in the kitchen where the refrigerator's emptiness had a way of making itself felt. The cafeteria on this particular Tuesday was loud by the time the main lunch period started. Chairs, scraping tile trays, clattering voices layering over each other, the way middle school voices do, full of performance and competition, and the relentless social arithmetic of 13-year-olds trying to figure out where they stood. Marcus kept his eyes down and moved through the lines steadily. She looked at the screen and then at Marcus with the flat expression of someone delivering information rather than a verdict. "Marcus, your account is at 0. You cannot take the tray." Marcus had heard these words before. Not every week, but often enough that his body had learned to receive them without visible reaction. He took the tray from the counter and placed it back on the return rack. He did it carefully, without drama, the way you do something when you are trying very hard to communicate that it does not affect you. But the line behind him was longer than usual that morning. Kevin Marsh was 13, an 8th grader, with the particular social confidence of a boy who had discovered early that making other people uncomfortable made him feel less so. He was standing 3 people back in the line with 2 of his friends, and he had watched the whole exchange. His voice was loud enough for the surrounding tables to hear. Again, he said, drawing the word out, "Dang, Marcus, your mama cannot even afford school lunch." The laughter that followed was not universal. Some kids looked away. Some looked at their trays. But enough of them laughed that the sound carried, and in a cafeteria full of middle schoolers, enough was everything. Marcus did not turn around. He stood with his back to Kevin Marsh, and his hands at his sides, and his jaw tight enough that a small muscle near his ear flickered once. His eyes were fixed on the middle distance, on nothing, on the specific nowhere that a person looks at when they are refusing to let what is happening on the outside reach what is happening on the inside. Mrs. Greer looked at Marcus, and then at Kevin Marsh, and then back at her register. She had a line to manage. She moved to the next student. Marcus walked to a table near the back of the cafeteria and sat down. He folded his hands on the table in front of him. He did not have a tray. He sat there for the duration of the lunch period while the cafeteria moved around him, loud and ordinary, and he looked at his own hands and waited for the bell. Near the far wall, a mop moved in slow arcs across the tile. Elijah Brooks had been cleaning this cafeteria during the lunch period 3 times a week for more than 15 years. He worked the perimeter, staying out of the way of foot traffic, keeping close to the walls where spills migrated and trays were set down carelessly. Most days no one looked at him. He had long since stopped expecting them to. He had watched the moment at the register. He had heard Kevin Marsh's voice. He had seen Marcus put the tray back. Now he watched the boy sitting alone at the back table, hands flat on the surface, staring at nothing, and the mop in Elijah's hands slowed and then stopped. He stood there for a moment that was longer than it appeared. His face did not arrange itself into pity. It was something older than pity and more precise. It was the look of a man who recognized something he had seen before, not in this cafeteria, not in this building, but in himself, a long time ago, in a different place, wearing a different face. He did not approach the boy. He did not say anything. He pushed his cart to the hallway and kept working. Marcus walked home that afternoon, the long way, without meaning, to 14 blocks through the part of the neighborhood that took him past the check-cashing place on 40th Street. and the diner that had been closed for 2 years, with a paper notice still taped inside the window, and a bus stop where the bench had been broken since last spring and no one had come to fix it. He walked with his backpack on one shoulder and his eyes on the sidewalk. The apartment building on Clement Street had a security light above the entrance that buzzed when it came on at dusk, a thin, persistent sound that you stopped hearing after a while. The paint near the foundation was peeling in long strips. From the third floor, as Marcus climbed the stairs, he could hear his neighbor's television, and underneath it, the low register sound of a couple arguing in the way that people argue when they are too tired to stop. Denise Reed came home at 7. She was still in her scrubs, a blue set with a small bleach stain near the left pocket that had been there for 2 weeks. She set her bag down by the door and opened the refrigerator and stood in front of it for a moment. Eggs, a tub of margarine, half a loaf of white bread. She closed the door and got the pan out. She did not ask Marcus about school. She was exhausted in the specific way of someone who has been on her feet for 10 hours doing work that requires her to be present and careful and patient with other people's suffering. Marcus set the table without being asked, and they ate together at the small kitchen table with the television on low. She asked about his homework. He said it was fine. She nodded and ate. He watched her hands wrapped around her fork and thought about how she woke up before the sun every single day and came home like this every single night, and he did not say one word to her about what had happened in that cafeteria. Later in his room, he lay on his back on top of the covers and looked at the water stain on the ceiling that had been there since before they moved in. He could hear the neighbor's television through the wall, a laugh track running under some program he couldn't identify. He thought, if this is what it feels like at 12, what does the rest of it look like? He did not have an answer. He turned on his side and closed his eyes and eventually slept. He did not know that somewhere on the other side of the city, a man was sitting at a kitchen table with a notepad and a small envelope of cash, doing arithmetic by hand in pencil, calculating what he could afford to give away this month. He did not know that by the time he walked into Jefferson Heights the next morning, someone had already solved the problem he was dreading. The next morning, Marcus moved through the apartment quietly the way he always did, and walked to school with his hands in the front pocket of his hoodie and his eyes on the sidewalk ahead of him. He got to the cafeteria early, same as always. He stood in line and watched the counter and told himself it did not matter, that he would find something else that he had gone without before, and could do it again. He told himself this is the way you tell yourself things that you do not actually believe but need to say anyway, just to keep moving forward. When he reached the register, Mrs. Greer took his card and ran it through the scanner without looking up. She paused, looked at her screen. Then she looked at Marcus over the top of her reading glasses with an expression that carried no particular warmth, but also no particular hardness. Just the neutral face of someone delivering a routine result. "You are good, Marcus," she said. "Go ahead." He stood there for 1 full second longer than he should have. He took the card back and looked at it briefly, the way you look at something when you are checking whether it is real. Then he picked up his tray and moved down the line and found his usual table near the back and sat down. He did not celebrate. He did not look around to see if anyone had noticed. He ate quickly and efficiently with his eyes on the tray, and when the bell rang, he picked up his backpack and went to class. He assumed it was a mistake that had been corrected. Some district program he had been enrolled in without knowing. A delay in processing that had finally resolved itself. He did not question it, because questioning it meant drawing attention to it, and drawing attention to it meant the possibility that someone would look closer and take it away. So he accepted it quietly and moved on. But then it happened again. 2 weeks later, same thing, the account at 0, the scanner running, Mrs. Greer looking at her screen. "You are good, go ahead." And again the month after that. And again after that. Every time the account drained to nothing within a day or two, sometimes overnight, the balance was back. Not a large amount. Never more than what was needed to cover the next several days, but consistent, reliable arriving with a precision that felt almost deliberate. Marcus stopped trying to explain it. He filed it under the category of things that were true, but that he did not fully understand and could not afford to examine too closely. There was a district assistance program, he assumed some fund that schools like Jefferson Heights had access to for students in his situation. He was not the only one, probably. The system was helping him. That was enough to know. What he did not realize was what that certainty was doing to him underneath in the parts of himself he did not monitor as carefully. He stopped doing the math during class. That was the first thing anyone might have noticed if they had been watching closely enough. Before, he had spent portions of most school days running quiet calculations in the back of his mind, not math problems from a worksheet, but the other kind, the constant low-level arithmetic of a child managing scarcity. Whether the account would clear, whether he should save the lunch and eat it slowly, or eat it fast before anything changed. Whether today would be the day the problem came back in front of everyone again. That calculation had been running in some corner of his brain almost continuously for months, and it took up space, real space, the kind that should have been occupied by other things. When it stopped, the space opened up. It did not happen overnight. It was gradual, like a room getting brighter as clouds move off the sun, slow enough that you do not notice it happening, but clear enough in retrospect. Marcus started finishing his homework the same night it was assigned, instead of the morning it was due. He started reading ahead in his English textbook, not because anyone asked him to, but because the story they were on was interesting, and he wanted to know what happened next. He started raising his hand in class once, then more. In November, Miss Tatum handed back a set of essays with comments written in red pen in the margins. She stopped at Marcus's desk and held his paper for a moment before setting it down. "Marcus," she said, "this is exceptional work." He looked at the paper. There were more red marks on it than anyone else's, but they were not corrections. They were questions she had written in the margins, things like, "Say more here," and "What does this remind you of?" and "This sentence is doing something interesting." He had written about his walk home from school, the 14 blocks, the things you noticed when you walked the same route every day for months and started to see it differently. He shrugged at Miss Tatum. He said he had time to think. She looked at him for a moment in the way that good teachers look at students when they are seeing something the student does not yet see in themselves, and then she moved on to the next desk. But she remembered that essay. She would remember it for years. On the other side of the building at 5:45 every morning, Elijah Brooks came through the staff entrance with his time card and his thermos and the same navy uniform he had been wearing in variations for more than a decade. He moved through the building in the order he had learned through years of repetition, the order that covered the most ground, with the least backtracking, the order of a man who had made an art form out of thoroughness and invisibility. He took the number 22 bus home every afternoon at 4:30. His apartment was 6 stops from the school on the 3rd floor of a building that was clean and quiet, and had a landlord who fixed things when asked. The apartment itself was small, 1 bedroom, a kitchen with a window that faced the alley, a living room with a couch and a bookshelf, and a television he turned on mostly for company. Everything in it was organized with the precision of someone who had once lived in spaces where organization was not optional. On his kitchen table on the evenings when the account needed replenishing, there was a plain white envelope and a small notepad with a spiral binding at the top. Elijah sat at the table and wrote his monthly bills in pencil, the way he always had: rent, electricity, gas, groceries, and at the bottom of the list, in the same pencil, a separate line that had been there since October. He still paid his mother's old prescription costs, the tail end of medical debts from the years before she passed, small amounts, now almost done. But he paid them because they were his to pay, and because finishing a thing you started mattered to him even when no one was watching. He calculated the number at the bottom of the list carefully. Sometimes it was $18. Sometimes it reached 30. The amount was whatever was left after everything else, not what he wished he could give, but what was actually there. He went to the school finance window before the building opened, when the hallways were still empty, and the lights in the main corridor were on their low morning setting. A clerk sat behind the glass, young, usually eating breakfast, usually looking at something on the desk in front of her. He pushed the cash through the slot and said, "Just for a student account, you will know which one." The clerk did not look up for long. She logged it the way she logged everything that did not fit a standard category, anonymous donor, miscellaneous fund, and moved on. Elijah walked back down the empty hallway toward the custodial wing, his cartwheels making their familiar sound on the tile, that small, rhythmic squeak that was as much a part of Jefferson Heights as the bell schedule or the smell of the cafeteria on pizza day. The hallway was completely empty. No one saw him. No one was supposed to. By the end of that school year, 9 months of payments, Marcus Reed had finished 7th grade with a B+ average. It was the first time his grades had climbed that high and held. His homeroom teacher recommended him for the advanced English track in 8th grade, and when the department initially pushed back, saying the class was already full, the teacher had gone back a second time and made the case again, and eventually the spot was found. On the last day of school in June, Denise Reed sat at the kitchen table on Clement Street and read her son's report card. She read it twice. Then she set it down flat on the table and pressed both hands over her eyes and cried the quiet kind of crying that comes not from sadness, but from the particular relief of a person who has been holding something very heavy for a very long time and is finally allowed to set it down. She believed she had held the walls up. She had worked every shift and paid every bill she could pay and kept her son fed and clothed and in school, and she had done it through sheer force of will and refusal to quit. She was not wrong about any of that. She had done all of those things. She just had not done them entirely alone. On that same afternoon, Elijah was at work. He did not know it was report card day. He had no way of knowing how Marcus had done. He pushed his cart past the cafeteria on his way to the east corridor, and he paused at the entrance for a moment. Looking at the rows of empty tables, the chairs flipped up the floor, already cleaned and drying from the morning service. He looked at the table near the back, where a thin boy in a gray hoodie had once sat with his hands flat on the surface and nothing in front of him. He nodded once to no one, to nothing, to the specific private satisfaction of a man who had done what he believed was right and expected nothing further from it. Then he pushed the cart forward and kept going. The years after that moved the way years do when you are not watching them carefully. Marcus Reed moved through high school with the kind of focused momentum that made teachers remember him and counselors advocate for him, and eventually produced a full scholarship offer from the University of Alabama that Denise Reed also cried over, this time at the kitchen table with Marcus sitting across from her, and both of them understanding, without saying it, what the alternative might have looked like. He graduated. He went further. A master's thesis on systemic barriers to academic achievement in under-resourced schools, drawn from everything he had seen and lived and understood about what it cost a child to be poor in a place that was supposed to be neutral. A doctorate in educational leadership. Work in school reform that carried his name into conversations in Montgomery and eventually beyond. Elijah Brooks stayed. The principals came and went, 4 of them across the years, each one with different priorities and different management styles, and different ideas about what Jefferson Heights needed. The student body shifted in demographics and size. The building got a new gym in 2011 and a new roof in 2018, and a technology lab that was funded by a grant, and then quietly defunded and then partially restored. The faces in the hallways changed every 4 years, the way they always had children arriving small and leaving taller and making way for the next group. Elijah's uniform stayed navy. His cart stayed gray. His route through the building stayed more or less the same, adjusted, only when construction or renovation forced a detour. When a younger custodian named Jerome joined the staff in 2022 and asked Elijah how he had lasted so long in the same job without going somewhere else, Elijah thought about it for a moment and then said something that Jerome wrote down later in a note on his phone because he wanted to remember it exactly. He said, "I never needed to know how it turned out. Doing right does not require a receipt." Jerome had not fully understood it at the time. He thought he would understand it better later. For 20 years, Marcus Reed carried gratitude toward a system he believed had helped him when he needed it most. He was right about the gratitude. He was wrong about the system. The truth was smaller than any program, quieter than any policy, and far more powerful than anything a district budget line could have produced. He just did not know it yet. 3 weeks into Marcus Reed's tenure at Jefferson Heights, the school began its quiet preparations for a retirement ceremony that almost no one outside the building would notice, and that the man being honored had already asked twice to keep as small as possible. 35 years was the number that kept appearing in the planning documents that circulated through the administrative offices that week. 35 years of service. It was the kind of number that looked simple on paper and felt enormous when you tried to hold it in your mind as something real as actual mornings and actual hours and actual work done by actual hands in actual hallways. The district's standard protocol for a retirement of that length included a plaque, a cake, and a gathering in whatever space was available. Elijah Brooks had reviewed the protocol and asked if the gathering could be limited to direct colleagues. He had used the word please. He had meant it. Sarah Mitchell had been Jefferson Heights' finance director for 11 years, and she understood the assignment she had been given when Linda Parker's successor asked her to pull together archival materials for the tribute display. Photos, if any existed, service records, any documentation that illustrated the scope of what Elijah had contributed. It was the kind of task that felt straightforward until you started doing it and discovered that 35 years of a person's working life, when that person had spent those years being systematically overlooked, left behind almost nothing in the official record except time cards and payroll entries. She went to the storage room in the basement, the one adjacent to the old boiler room where physical records from the pre-digital era were kept in bankers' boxes stacked on metal shelving. The school had moved to digital record-keeping in 2008, which meant everything before that year existed only on paper in boxes labeled by academic year in marker that had faded to a pale brown. She pulled the boxes from 2003 through 2007 and carried them to her office 2 at a time. She was not looking for anything specific beyond whatever might be useful for the tribute. Service logs, maintenance records that might show the scope of the work. She opened the first box and began going through the contents methodically, the way she went through everything in order without skipping ahead. The finance logs from that period were handwritten columnar entries in blue or black ink, each page representing a month of transactions. Lunch account, activity supply purchases, miscellaneous fund disbursements. Sarah had grown up in a world of spreadsheets and did not love handwritten ledgers, but she could read them efficiently enough. She was on the third box, the one covering the 2004 to 2005 academic year, when she noticed it. The lunch account records were filed by student name in a separate section at the back of each month's log. She was not reviewing them with any particular purpose, just moving through pages, when a name stopped her hand mid-turn. Reed Marcus, 7th grade. The account showed a recurring pattern that was unusual enough to make her slow down. The balance would drop to 0 or near 0, and then within 2 or 3 days, a small cash deposit would appear logged under the same description every time. Anonymous donor miscellaneous student fund. The amounts varied. $18, 23, 31, 47 in 1 month when the account had been particularly depleted. Never a round number. Always just enough to cover several days forward. Sarah set the page down and thought for a moment. Then she went back to the beginning of the academic year and traced the pattern from October through June. It was there every time, irregular in amount, but precise in timing, always arriving within 72 hours of the account reaching zero, as if someone had been watching the balance and responding to it directly. She pulled the payroll records from the same box, which she had included in the stack, because they contained Elijah's service documentation. She compared the deposit dates to the staff pay schedule. The school had paid custodial staff on a bi-weekly cycle every other Friday. She laid the two sets of dates side by side on her desk and looked at them for a long time. Every deposit in Marcus Reed's lunch account had occurred within 2 business days of a custodial pay date. Every single one, across 9 months. She sat back in her chair and looked at the 2 pages and did not move for a while. Then she went back to the box and found the finance window sign-in logs, a separate ledger where the clerk on duty was supposed to record any cash transactions handled directly at the window rather than through the standard deposit process. Most of the entries were routine. But on a Wednesday in October of 2004, 2 days after the first anonymous deposit appeared in Marcus Reed's account, a clerk had written a brief note in the margin of the log in handwriting, different from the standard entries. Older black male, custodial uniform, paid $23 cash, declined to give name. Sarah read the note 3 times. She opened her laptop and navigated to the archived student records database, the older section, that had been scanned and uploaded during a district digitization project in 2015. She typed in the name Marcus Reed and selected the Jefferson Heights records. A file opened. A 7th grade school photo loaded on her screen, a thin boy in a gray hoodie looking at the camera with the careful neutrality of someone who had learned not to show too much in official settings. She looked at the photo. She looked at the finance window note. She looked at the payroll date and the deposit dates laid out side by side. She pulled the staff incident log from October 2004, a separate document she had included almost by accident, and found an entry from the cafeteria on a Tuesday morning, noting a student account issue that had resulted in a minor social disruption. The entry named Marcus Reed. The date was 2 days before the first anonymous cash deposit. She closed the folder on her laptop, opened it again, closed it. "Oh my God," she said. The office was empty. No one heard her. She picked up her phone and called Linda Parker. Linda Parker was 71 years old now and lived in Huntsville, where she had retired 3 years earlier after a career in school administration that had spanned 4 decades. She answered on the 3rd ring in the brisk way she answered everything, as if she had been expecting the call and was ready to get to the point. Sarah walked her through it carefully. The deposits, the timing, the payroll alignment, the cashier's note. She read the note aloud, word for word. She told Linda about the incident log entry and the 2-day gap between Marcus's cafeteria humiliation and the first payment. Linda was quiet through all of it. Not the quiet of someone waiting to respond, but the quiet of someone absorbing something that required more space than a quick reaction could provide. When Sarah finished, Linda did not speak immediately. When she did, her voice was slower than usual and carried something in it that was not quite grief, but lived in the same neighborhood. She said, "I signed off on those miscellaneous fund entries for years. Every month when the reconciliation came through, I saw that line, and I assumed it was the district's assistance program running through our account. I never once thought to trace it." A pause. Elijah has worked in that building since 1989, she said. He was there before I was principal. He was mopping those floors the day I arrived, and he was mopping them the day I left. Both women stayed with that for a moment, the weight of what had been present and unexamined for so long, not through cruelty or indifference, but through the particular invisibility that settles around certain people in certain roles until they become part of the architecture, noticed only when something breaks. Sarah asked if Linda thought Marcus knew. Linda said no, she did not think so. She said the way Marcus had described his path in interviews in his published work in his dissertation was always as a story about systemic support, about what institutions could do for students when they functioned the way they were supposed to. He had never mentioned a specific person. He had never named anyone. Sarah asked if Elijah knew Marcus was back. Linda was quiet again. She said she did not think Elijah had made the connection. The name Dr. Reed appearing on a district announcement would not necessarily have meant anything to a man who had known a 12-year-old boy named Marcus 20 years ago and had never followed his story forward. They talked for a while about what to do with what Sarah had found. There were options. They could tell Marcus privately, give him the information, before any public moment let him decide how to respond. They could find a way to tell Elijah, directly explain what Sarah had discovered, give him the chance to confirm or deny. They could let the retirement ceremony pass and say nothing. Linda said, "This is not our story. It belongs to both of them, and it always has." They agreed that the ceremony was the right moment, the only moment that would hold the full weight of what needed to be said. The timing, the room, the people who should witness it, all of it aligned. But Sarah reminded Linda that Elijah had submitted his request in writing. Small ceremony. No speeches. Please. Linda said she knew. She said trying to prepare Elijah for what was coming would result in him finding a way to prevent it, because that was exactly who he was and had always been. Then she said, "So we do not ask him. We ask Marcus." Marcus Reed had spent the better part of his adult life building a professional identity around the idea that systems, when designed with intention and executed with care, could change the trajectories of children who had been given the least. He had written 94 pages arguing that point. He had built programs around it. He had stood in front of school boards and city councils and made the case with data and conviction. In 2 weeks, he was going to learn that the most important intervention in his own life had nothing to do with a system, and the man who had made it was currently 40 feet down the hall from his office, replacing a fluorescent bulb in the east corridor ceiling with the same quiet efficiency he had brought to every task in that building for 35 years. Sarah Mitchell knocked on Marcus Reed's office door on a Thursday morning, 9 days before Elijah's retirement ceremony, and asked if he had a few minutes. He said yes. He was reviewing enrollment projections and was glad for the interruption. He did not know yet that the interruption was going to change the shape of everything he thought he understood about his own life. Sarah came in and closed the door behind her. She did not sit down immediately. She set a manila folder on his desk, the kind with the metal clasp at the top, thick with papers. And then she sat in the chair across from him and folded her hands in her lap and said she needed to show him something she had found while pulling records for the retirement tribute. Her voice was calm and methodical, the voice of a woman who had decided on her way up the stairs that the most respectful thing she could do was deliver the information clearly and let it do its own work. She walked him through it in order. The archived finance logs, the recurring deposits in a student lunch account, the timing pattern always within 72 hours of the balance hitting zero, always following a custodial pay date. She explained how she had cross-referenced the dates and then found the finance window log with the handwritten cashier's note. She pushed the folder toward him and let him look. Marcus picked up the first page, the lunch account ledger, and read it with the careful attention he brought to every document placed in front of him. He turned to the next page, and the next. He did not speak. The only sound in the room was the building around them, the distant percussion of lockers opening and closing, sneakers on tile, a bell ringing somewhere in the east wing, marking the end of a period. He found the cashier's note. He read it slowly. Older black male, custodial uniform, paid $23 cash, declined to give name. He set the page down with the same care he had picked it up with. He looked at it for a moment. Then he found his own 7th grade school photo in the file, the scanned image Sarah had printed, a thin boy in a gray hoodie with careful eyes, and he looked at that too. The silence in the room was the kind that had weight and dimension, the kind you could almost feel pressing against the walls. He said, "Who authorized this?" It did not come out as a question. It came out as something a person says when they already know the answer is going to require more from them than they are currently prepared to give. Sarah said no one authorized it. She said he paid out of his own pocket every time for the entire school year. Marcus set the folder down on the desk in front of him. He folded his hands on top of it and looked at the middle of his desk, at the surface of the wood, at nothing. Then he said, "Elijah Brooks." He said it the way you say something when the conclusion has arrived before the explanation has finished, when the pieces have assembled themselves faster than you meant them to. He said, "The janitor." Neither of those came out as questions either. Sarah said yes. She left the folder with him and closed the door quietly on her way out. Marcus did not move for a long time after that. The school continued its day around him, indifferent and ordinary, the way schools do, the way life does, carrying on at full volume, while something enormous happens quietly inside one person in one room. He could hear a class changing in the hall outside his door, the specific shuffle and chatter of students moving between periods, a teacher's voice cutting through the noise with a reminder about Friday's assignment. He thought about the morning he had walked into the Jefferson Heights cafeteria, bracing for rejection, and Mrs. Greer had scanned his card and looked at her screen and told him he was good to go. He thought about the specific quality of relief he had felt in that moment. A relief so large and so fast that he had immediately suppressed it, had made himself pick up the tray slowly and walk to his table without showing it on his face, because showing it would have meant admitting how afraid he had been. He had spent 20 years attributing that relief to a program, to a system that had for once functioned the way it was supposed to. He had written about it obliquely in his dissertation, never naming Jefferson Heights specifically, but drawing on the experience as evidence that institutional support mechanisms, when properly funded and administered, could interrupt the cycle of stress and scarcity that prevented low-income students from accessing their own potential. He had built his professional identity in part around that argument. He thought about his mother coming home at 7 in the evening with her hospital scrubs still on, and the particular exhaustion in her eyes that he had spent his childhood trying not to add to. She had believed completely and without doubt that she had held everything together herself. She had not been wrong about the holding. She had been wrong about the alone. Someone had been quietly helping hold the roof while she held the walls, and she had never known, and Marcus had never known, and the man who had done it had never said a word to either of them. That afternoon, Marcus told his assistant he was doing a building walk, a routine observation, and he moved through the corridors with a legal pad under his arm, the way a new principal moves when he is learning the physical reality of his school. He turned down the east corridor and stopped. Elijah was at the far end of the hall near the window bank, standing on a 2-step stool with his head slightly tilted toward the ceiling. He was replacing a tile in the drop ceiling, one that had warped from water damage the previous winter. He worked with both hands, fitting the tile into the grid with a deliberate precision, pressing each corner gently to test the fit before committing to it. Marcus stood at the other end of the hallway and watched. Elijah did not look down. He finished the tile and stepped off the stool and looked up at his work from the floor, moving his head slightly to check it from two angles the way someone does when they care about the result and not just the completion. He nodded once to himself. He folded the stool, set it against the cart, and pushed the cart around the corner. He was gone without ever knowing Marcus had been there. Marcus stood in the empty corridor for a moment after the cart wheels faded. His legal pad was still under his arm. He had not written anything on it. His face held something that did not have a simple name, the layered compression of grief and reverence, and the specific disorientation of discovering that a story you thought you knew the shape of has always had a different shape. That the ground under the narrative you have been standing on is not where you believed it was. He walked back to his office and sat down and looked at the folder still open on his desk. That evening, he called his mother from the parking lot of a gas station on his way home, because he needed to be moving when he had the conversation, and he could not have it inside the building. Denise Reed answered on the second ring. She was semi-retired now, picking up occasional shifts at the hospital, but mostly free of the grinding schedule that had defined most of Marcus's childhood. Her voice on the phone still carried its particular brand of alertness, always slightly ahead of the conversation, always ready. He said, "Mama, did you ever know that someone helped us with my lunch account at Jefferson Heights?" The silence on her end was immediate and specific. When she spoke, she was already defensive, her pride moving to the front of the sentence before the words did. She said she did not know what he was talking about, and that she had handled everything herself. He said he knew that. He said he knew she had. But he said he had just found out that someone had helped too, and he needed her to know. She was quiet again. Then she said, "Who?" He said, "The janitor, Mama. The janitor who was there the whole time." 10 seconds passed. He counted them without meaning to. The gas station's overhead lights buzzed faintly, and a truck pulled out of the lot, and the night was warm the way Birmingham's September nights still were, and his mother said nothing for 10 full seconds. Then quietly, in a voice stripped of everything except the bare weight of the moment, she said, "Lord," just that one word. But it carried everything: the years of pride, the years of exhaustion, the years of believing she had done it entirely alone. The sudden rupture of that belief against the reality of a stranger's quiet generosity. The impossible gratitude of a woman who had spent decades not knowing there was something to be grateful for. Marcus held the phone and did not try to fill the silence. The retirement ceremony was 5 days away. Marcus had made one decision sitting in his office with the folder open in front of him, looking at his own 7th grade face looking back at him. Elijah Brooks was not going to leave Jefferson Heights High School after 35 years without knowing what he had done and what it had become. What Marcus did not yet know was that Sarah Mitchell had mentioned the discovery to Linda Parker, and Linda Parker had mentioned it carefully and in confidence to one other person. And that person had not kept it as carefully as Linda had hoped. In a school building in a community that had known Elijah Brooks for 3.5 decades, some stories moved faster than the people carrying them intended. The story was already moving. It moved the way things move in a place where people have worked alongside each other for decades. Not loudly, not all at once, but steadily, the way water finds its way through a building, following the paths of least resistance, arriving in rooms where it was not expected. By the morning of the ceremony, Jerome knew. He had known for 3 days and had not said anything to Elijah directly, because he understood instinctively, without being told, that this was not his information to deliver. But the knowing had changed the way he moved around Elijah in those 3 days. Slightly more careful, slightly more present, watching the older man with the particular attention of someone who has been given a piece of context that reframes everything they thought they were looking at. The Jefferson Heights Gymnasium on that Friday morning looked the way school gymnasiums look when they have been decorated by people who care about the occasion but are working with a limited budget and a folding table. Paper banners in blue and gold, the school colors taped along the wall above the bleachers. Rows of folding chairs arranged on the gym floor facing a small podium with a microphone. A table to the side with a sheet cake and a punch bowl and a framed certificate from the district. Someone had put a small vase of yellow flowers next to the framed certificate, which was the kind of detail that a person either noticed or did not. And the people who noticed it felt something, and the people who did not kept moving. The room filled gradually. Teachers came in still carrying coffee, finding seats near colleagues, the low conversational hum of a staff that had been together long enough to be comfortable. District representatives arrived and arranged themselves near the front. Several parents who had heard about the ceremony through the school newsletter had come as well, sitting along the outer edges of the folding chairs, with the slightly uncertain posture of people not sure how much space they were entitled to take up. Jerome sat in the front row. He had arrived 40 minutes early to make sure of it. He had also, through a combination of persistence and personal appeal that took most of his lunch break on Wednesday, convinced 11 other members of the building support staff to attend, people who cleaned and maintained and repaired and moved through Jefferson Heights every day in the same invisible register that Elijah always had. They sat together in the first 2 rows on the left side, a group that did not usually appear at school events as a collective, and their presence had a weight that several teachers noticed without being able to name. Linda Parker came in through the side door at 8:55. She was 71 years old and wore a dark blue blazer and the composed expression of someone who had spent a career managing the emotional content of rooms. She found a seat near the middle and did not look around excessively. She looked at her hands in her lap. In the back row on the right side near the exit, Denise Reed sat with her purse on her lap and her back straight. She had driven up from her apartment in Homewood that morning, arriving early enough to park without rushing. She was wearing a dark gray dress and small pearl earrings that Marcus recognized from his childhood as the ones she wore when something mattered. No one in the room knew who she was except Marcus and Sarah Mitchell and Linda Parker. She sat quietly and watched the room fill and did not speak to anyone. Elijah came in with Jerome at 9 o'clock, exactly, which was Elijah's way, arriving at the agreed time, and not before, because arriving early at your own retirement ceremony felt presumptuous in a way he could not fully articulate, but felt clearly. He was wearing his Navy uniform. 3 people had suggested in the preceding week that he might want to wear something else for the occasion. He had thanked each of them and worn the uniform anyway. Jerome touched his arm once as they entered, brief and light, and Elijah gave him a sideways look that said he had noticed, but was choosing not to comment. Dr. Patricia Hale opened the ceremony with the formal remarks that the district protocol required. She spoke about years of service and institutional memory and the kind of dedication that kept a school functioning at the level its students deserved. She said Elijah's name several times. She said 35 years several times. The remarks were warm and genuine and largely interchangeable with the remarks that would have been given for any person retiring after a long career in public service, which was not a criticism of Dr. Hale, but simply a reflection of the limits of formal language when applied to a person who had spent 35 years deliberately defying easy description. Elijah sat in the front row with his hands on his knees and the expression of a man enduring something he had agreed to in a moment of weaker resistance and was now seeing through on principle. Marcus was introduced as the new principal, offering remarks on behalf of the current administration. This was listed on the printed program as a brief acknowledgement. The teachers in the room expected something brief and respectful and professionally warm. Marcus stood up from his seat in the second row and walked to the podium and adjusted the microphone and looked out at the room. He looked at Elijah sitting in the front row. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and removed a folded set of papers, the prepared remarks he had written on Tuesday evening, 3 pages, carefully constructed. He held them for a moment. Then he set them down on the podium, face down, and pushed them slightly to the side. The gesture was small and visible, and it changed the quality of attention in the room immediately, the way a shift in a speaker's posture or voice can signal to an audience that what is coming next is outside the planned order of things. He said, "I am going to tell you all something I only learned 10 days ago, and I need you to hear it." The room did not make a sound. He started with the cafeteria. He described Jefferson Heights in October of 2004 the way a person describes a place they have been carrying inside them for 20 years without permission to set it down. He described the lunch line and the register and the sound of the beep, and Mrs. Greer's flat procedural voice telling him his account was at 0. He described putting the tray back and walking to the empty table near the back wall and sitting down with nothing in front of him while the cafeteria moved on around him as if nothing had happened. He said, "I was 12 years old, and I thought I was invisible. I was wrong. Someone saw me." He walked through what Sarah had found, the ledger entries, the deposit pattern, the payroll alignment, the cashier's handwritten note at the finance window. He described the amounts, never a round number, always just enough, always arriving within days of the account hitting 0. He reached into a folder he had placed on the podium before the ceremony started and held up a single page, a photocopy of the original ledger. And he said, "This is the document. This is what it looked like written down by hand in a school finance log in 2004. The room was completely silent, in the particular way of people who have stopped thinking about whether they are comfortable in their chairs. Marcus set the page down and looked at Elijah directly. He said, "For an entire school year, this man on a custodian's salary made sure I could eat. He never signed his name. He never came to find me and tell me. He never told anyone in this building what he was doing. He just did it. Every time the account ran out, he refilled it with his own money, quietly, without asking for anything in return." Elijah's face moved through several things in quick succession. The first was a mild confusion, the expression of a person who hears their name in a context that does not immediately compute. Then something shifted underneath that slower, older, a recognition, traveling up from a part of his memory he had not visited in a long time. The cafeteria in 2004, the boy at the back table with his hands flat on the surface and nothing in front of him. The finance window before the building opened. The clerk who did not look up. He became very still. Not the stillness of shock, but the stillness of a man who has kept something in a specific interior place for 20 years and is now feeling it be located from the outside. For the first time, the strange exposure of a private thing becoming witnessed. His jaw tightened once. His eyes, which were dark and steady and usually gave very little away, went bright in the manner of eyes that are working harder than usual to hold something in. He looked at Marcus at the podium, and Marcus looked back at him, and neither of them looked away. Elijah nodded. Once. The same single nod he had given to an empty cafeteria 20 years ago when he looked at a boy's usual table and felt the quiet, private satisfaction of having done what he believed was right. Marcus turned his face toward the back of the room. He said, "My mother is here today." In the back row, Denise Reed stood up. She was composed in the precise way of a woman who has decided to be composed, because the alternative is not something she will allow in a room full of strangers. Her hands were clasped in front of her fingers, laced together and pressed firm. She stood straight. Marcus said she worked 2 jobs, and she did everything right, and she spent 20 years believing she kept us together entirely on her own. I want her to know today that someone helped carry it, and that man is sitting in the front row of this gymnasium. The distance between the back row and the front row of the Jefferson Heights Gymnasium was perhaps 60 feet. Denise Reed looked across that distance at Elijah Brooks, and Elijah Brooks looked back at her, an older woman in a gray dress with pearl earrings standing very straight, and an older man in a navy uniform sitting very still, and the look between them carried 20 years of a story that neither of them had known they were sharing. Denise's lips moved. 2 words. Everyone near her could read them, and several people did. Thank you. Elijah pressed his lips together. His chin lowered slightly. He nodded for the second time. Jerome was on his feet before the applause started, which meant he was on his feet before most people in the room had fully processed what they were feeling. Operating on instinct, the instinct of a young man who recognized a moment that deserved to be met standing. The applause built from him outward, slow at first, the kind of applause that starts with the hands of people who are also crying, and therefore cannot clap as hard as they want to, and then it grew and filled the gymnasium, and the yellow flowers next to the framed certificate trembled slightly from the sound of it. Jerome had started recording when Marcus set his prepared remarks face down on the podium. He did not make a decision about it exactly. His phone was in his hand because his phone was always in his hand, and something in the change in the room's atmosphere told him to point it at the podium and let it run. He kept it steady through all of it, through Elijah's face and Denise standing and the 2 words she mouthed across the room, and he kept it running through the applause. That evening, he sat on his couch and looked at the footage for a long time before he posted it. He wrote the caption and rewrote it, and eventually settled on 14 words. New principal reveals school janitor secretly paid his lunch debt for a year. Nobody knew. By midnight, the video had 400,000 views. By 6 in the morning, 2 Birmingham television stations were running the story in their morning broadcasts. By noon, it had crossed into national education coverage. By the following evening, 3 morning shows had reached out for interviews, and a producer from a national news magazine program had sent an email to the Jefferson Heights main office asking about access. The comments came in the hundreds of thousands. Most of them said some version of the same thing, that this was one of those touching stories that reminded people what a human being was actually capable of, that these were the real-life stories that deserved to be told. That in a world full of noise and performance and people doing good things loudly for the benefit of cameras, here was a man who had done something quietly for 20 years and expected absolutely nothing. Elijah Brooks had spent 35 years being the man that a building full of people walked past every day without seeing. In 18 hours, the entire country knew his name, and he had not said a single word about any of it yet. That part was coming, and it was going to be the part that broke everyone open. Marcus called Elijah the next morning at 7:15 and asked if he could come by. He said he would bring coffee. Elijah said he took it black with 1 sugar and gave him the address without asking why Marcus wanted to come, which was itself a form of answer. The answer of a man who had been expecting the visit and had decided not to make it complicated. The apartment was on the 3rd floor of a building 6 stops from Jefferson Heights on the number 22 bus line. Marcus drove, parked on the street, and sat in the car for a moment before going up. He had the original ledger page in a folder on the passenger seat. He picked it up and carried it with him. The apartment was exactly what Marcus had imagined, without knowing he had been imagining it. Small, clean, ordered with the precision of someone for whom order was not an aesthetic preference, but a deeply held practice. The bed in the bedroom, visible through the open door, was made with military tightness corners folded under with intention. A single shelf of books along the living room wall arranged by size. A framed photograph on the shelf above the books, a woman in her 50s or 60s, dark eyes, a composed expression, the kind of face that had seen difficulty and not been diminished by it. Elijah's mother, Marcus, understood without asking. No trophies, no plaques, no evidence anywhere in the apartment that the man living in it expected to be recognized for anything. They sat at the kitchen table with their coffees, and Marcus set the folder down between them but did not open it. He did not say anything. He had learned in 20 years of working with people in difficult conversations that sometimes the most useful thing you could do was take up less space and let the other person find their way to the words they had been holding. Elijah looked at the folder. He sipped his coffee. The apartment was quiet except for the sound of the building around them, a faint vibration from somewhere below, the distant sound of a car on the street. Then Elijah said, "I remember that morning." He said it simply without preamble, the way you state a fact you have always known but have not been asked about until now. He said you put your tray back and you sat down with nothing. And you did not make a sound. Marcus looked at him and did not speak. Elijah said, "I have cleaned up after people my whole life. Messes they do not even notice they made." He paused. His coffee cup was still in his hand, held loosely. "But that morning, I thought, here is one I can actually fix." Marcus asked why he had never said anything. Why he had never come to find him, never let him know. The question came out quietly, without accusation. The genuine question of a man who needed to understand the shape of something before he could fully hold it. Elijah set his cup down on the table. He looked at Marcus with the steady, unhurried attention of someone who has had a long time to know their own mind. He said, "Because it was not about you knowing. It was about you eating." The kitchen was very quiet. Marcus looked down at the folder between them, and then back up at Elijah, and he felt something release in his chest that he had not known was held, the last resistance of a man who had spent his entire adult life constructing an explanation for his own survival, and was now being handed a simpler and more human one. He told Elijah what his life had become. The scholarship, the years at the University of Alabama, the master's degree, the dissertation, the doctorate, the work in schools across Alabama that had over time changed policies and shifted funding and moved numbers in ways that reached children he would never meet. He said he had spent 5 years writing about systemic barriers, arguing that institutions failed students like him and that he had been right about that. But he said he had left something out. He had left out the part where one person inside the institution looked at the same broken system and decided to act differently anyway. Elijah listened without interrupting. He did not shift in his chair or look for a way to deflect what was being said. He received it the way he received most things, with the patience of someone who did not need to manage the moment. When Marcus finished, Elijah said, "I did not change the system. You changed the system. I just made sure you had enough energy to get there." Marcus said, "That is not a small thing." Elijah said, "No, it is not." They sat with that for a while. Two men at a kitchen table in Birmingham on a Saturday morning, the coffee going slightly cool, the photograph of Elijah's mother watching from the shelf, the street sounds rising faintly from below. No audience, no camera, no podium. Just the first honest accounting between two people whose lives had been running parallel for 20 years, without either of them knowing it. 1 month after the retirement ceremony, Marcus stood at a podium in the Jefferson Heights Library, in front of a smaller and quieter gathering than the gymnasium had held. District staff, a few teachers, Sarah Mitchell, Jerome, and a reporter from the Birmingham News, who had been covering the story since Jerome's video went national. He announced the Elijah Brooks Student Support Initiative, a dedicated fund that would cover meal debt, school supplies, and basic necessities for Jefferson Heights students who needed it. The fund had been built from 2 sources. One was a reallocation of discretionary budget that Marcus had negotiated with the district over the preceding 3 weeks. The other was private donations, which had come in through a giving link that Jerome had added to the original video post the morning after it went up, and which had reached an amount that surprised everyone, including Marcus. The program was designed to operate anonymously. Students would never be told their costs had been covered. They would simply find, as Marcus had found at 12 years old, that the account was fine, and they could take their tray and sit down. Marcus explained this at the announcement and said because dignity matters more than gratitude. He did not look at Elijah when he said it. He did not need to. Among the first students quietly enrolled in the program that fall was a 15-year-old boy named Daniel Carter, who lived with his grandmother in an apartment building 4 blocks from Jefferson Heights, and who had been eating less at school than anyone on the staff had noticed. Daniel did not know he had been enrolled. He found out the same way Marcus had found out 20 years earlier by going to the register braced for a problem and discovering there was none. He took his tray. He sat down at a table near the window. He opened his textbook to the chapter he had not finished the night before, and he read it while he ate, and his face had the particular quality of concentration that belongs to a person who is not using any part of their attention to manage something they are afraid of. On the last day of Elijah's official employment, he arrived at Jefferson Heights at 5:45 in the morning, as he had arrived for 35 years. The building was quiet at that hour, the hallways lit on their low morning setting, the smell of the place carrying that particular combination of industrial cleaner and old building and the accumulated presence of thousands of people who had passed through and kept going. He did his full route. Every hallway, every bathroom, every surface that was his to maintain. Jerome walked beside him for the last 2 hours, not filling the silence just present, which was exactly right. At 4 in the afternoon, Elijah pushed his cart into the basement storage room for the last time and parked it in the spot where it always went flush against the left wall with the handle facing out. He straightened the supplies on the shelves, the bottles aligned by size, the clean rags folded and stacked. The shelves did not need straightening. He straightened them anyway. He stood at the light switch for a moment. The storage room looked the same as it had looked on his first day 35 years ago. The same metal shelving, the same concrete floor, the same single bulb in the ceiling that he had replaced himself more times than he could count. He turned off the light. He stood in the doorway for a moment in the dark. Then he closed the door. The Jefferson Heights cafeteria on a Tuesday in October is exactly what it has always been: loud and ordinary, and full of the specific energy of several hundred young people existing in close proximity to each other in the middle of the day. Trays, clattering chairs, scraping voices everywhere, a teacher trying to be heard over all of it, failing, trying again. Marcus stands near the back wall. Not where anyone would think to look for a principal. He stands where the custodial route ran along the perimeter, where a man with a mop used to work the edges of the room in long, slow arcs. He watches the lunch line. A boy at the register, the cashier scanning the card, a pause. The cashier nodding, the boy taking his tray and turning and walking to a table where his friends are already seated and arguing about something Marcus cannot hear. Marcus does not move for a long moment. There are people in every school, every hospital, every building in this country, doing invisible work, carrying invisible weight, making invisible choices that change invisible lives. We walk past them every day. We look at them without seeing them. We let them become part of the background of our lives without understanding that the background is sometimes the whole story. Elijah Brooks never asked to be seen, but he saw a child who needed to eat, and he did something about it. Quietly, without a name attached, without waiting to be asked. And that was enough. That was everything. These are the black stories that do not make the news until someone finally thinks to look at the receipts. These are the touching stories that remind us what an ordinary person can do when they choose decency over indifference. These are real-life stories, not dramatic, not convenient, not resolved in a single clean moment, but true in the way that the best life stories always are, slowly, quietly, and at great personal cost, to someone who never expected a thank you. In a sunlit hallway on the east side of Jefferson Heights High School, a custodial cart stands empty against the wall. No one is pushing it. The school sounds continue around it, bells and voices and sneakers on tile and the ordinary, irreplaceable noise of a building full of children moving through their days. For every Elijah, they are still out there. Pay attention. If this story moved you the way it moved us, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. And if you believe that the people who do the quiet work deserve to be seen, stay with this channel, because there are more stories like this one waiting to be told.